The research questions I chose to focus my literature review on are, does enclave bias exist in Moldova? If it exists, does it correlate geographically with support for the new legislation aimed at limiting international funding for nonprofit and civil society organizations in Moldova? If there is a correlation, is the 5+2, the OSCE's 5+2 negotiation format the correct forum or best suited forum to address those issues? I begin my literature review looking at the field of conflict and dispute resolution. The first article is by Babbitt and Hampson, Conflict Resolution as a Field of Inquiry, Practice Informing Theory. The authors make the claim that the field is a vibrant interdisciplinary field where theory and practice meet real-world events. Another article I use in this section is by Hartley and Modell, entitled The First Conflict Resolution Movement, 1956 through 71. They write that studies of war, peace, and national security policy by American social scientists became dramatically more common during the 1950s after World War II. One explanation for this is the introduction of nuclear weapons into warfare and the potential societal impact that nuclear weapons might have. Babbitt and Ulster, though, address the interests of those external to a conflict zone in their text. They assert that tensions between justice and reconciliation are confronted not just by local players, but also those external parties who want to contain the costs of war. These authors view the field of conflict resolution as having two distinct scholarships, conflict transformation and conflict settlement. In either case, the aim is to decrease violence and increase what might be called the assimilation of interests. So the next section kind of focuses on my first question, enclave bias. The concept of enclave bias was first proposed by Messi et al. In their article, Ethnic Enclaves and Intolerance, the Case of Yugoslavia. The authors hypothesized that the concentration or dispersal of similarly identified people can be a foundation for sentiments of pride, fear, for the felt need of security, and for the willingness to mobilize and to attain political goals. Messi et al. Cross-referenced census data from the former Yugoslavia with questionnaires that they canvassed. Their theory holds that in identifying degrees of group identity through a spatially structured majority-minority perspective, this aids in explaining the persistence of intolerance and tensions. The authors emphasize structural factors such as population arrangement and distribution of power. Essentially, this means that, like, if a majority group member was living within a minority enclave, they'd experience higher levels of intolerance than if they were living within just a majority population of their peers. Through the questionnaires, the authors were also able to identify other factors that impact varying degrees of intolerance. These included being in a mixed marriage, how often you read the news, being employed, or whether you live in a rural or urban setting. So next I'm going to kind of step back and look at global governance generally, and in developing a comprehensive understanding of the international environment in which my research is conducted. Thomas Weiss offers a definition of global governance in his article, Rethinking Global Governance, Complexity, Authority, Power, and Change. He defines it as a collective effort to identify, understand, or address worldwide problems and processes that go beyond the capabilities of individual states, at any moment in time providing government-like services in the absence of a world government. So in my research, I'm kind of interested in the interaction between states and civil society. Weiss notes that the political authority of some great powers and the international economic organizations, along with the absence of authority, among others things, largely those states that encounter globalization as a quasi-force of nature, underpinned growing dissatisfaction in civil society. In the midst of this dissatisfaction, Weiss offers three developments for why this dissatisfaction occurred and how civil societies have come to address international problems. The first is the character of the problems. They've become transnational in nature, so no state, no matter how powerful, can labor under the illusion that it can protect its population from these threats. One example given by Weiss is money laundering. And actually, in Moldova, money laundering is a significant issue. The Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs has reported that since Moldova's economy is largely cash-based, it remains highly vulnerable to money laundering activities. In fact, in 2014, $18 billion were moved through Moldova's banks in one day, which is 2.5 times the country's GDP. Contrasting Weiss's piece a little bit is Craig Murphy's article, Global Governance, Poorly Done and Poorly Understood. He explores the shifts in character of international relations that follow World War II. He explores a little further. He takes a little more of a pessimistic view. Murphy explains that international institutions govern almost every dimension of global governance, from security to trade to telecommunications to health, and without what world government we have, it would truly be a jungle out there for firms who care to venture beyond their own national borders. So he focuses on morals and ethics in his piece. His article asserts that while there have been advancements in spreading liberal democracy and global rights, global governance is likely to remain inefficient and incapable of shifting resources from the world's wealthy to the world's poor. It will remain pro-market and relatively insensitive to the concerns of labor and the rural poor. To Murphy, the international environment is dominated by economic elites who advance unregulated financial activity and push back against the democratic gains that have been won over the past century. He also extends his pessimistic analysis of global governance beyond the misled financial sector, and asserts that global governance has failed in addressing genocide as well. Perhaps offering a shimmering of light, there are two emerging trends that Murphy makes note of in his article. That is the increase in conventions and the increase in private authorities that offer some form of regulation. However, in the end, Murphy struggles with an unchanging global realist notion of sovereignty that he would claim stems from the U.S.'s inherent power and subsequent economic interests. One article that focused on addresses the field of research in global governance, was Andrew Hurl's article, The Theory and Practice of Global Governance, the Worst of All Possible Worlds. He offers some direction for the field. He identifies a gap between theory and practice, between academia and policymaking. He writes that there are those who believe that the gap should be closed, and others that believe that academics benefit from the separation of power and politics. He desires a mixed approach to research, and thinks that academics benefit from being able to ask those controversial questions, and practitioners actually benefit from this as well. So the next section is on international institutions. This section takes a closer look at the structures and nature of international organizations themselves. I start with Ruggie, his article on multilateralism, the anatomy of an institution. He gets at the essence of international organizations, and he states that at its core refers to at its core, international organizations are coordinating relationships among three or more states in accordance with certain principles. The most important principle of multilateralism in international organizations, according to Ruggie, is non-discrimination. It's not the number of relationships you have, according to Ruggie, it's the quality of the relationships. Bilateral relationships tend to be competitive and allows for superpowers to take advantage of weaker states. Actually, in the 5+2 negotiation format employed in the Moldova Transnistria talks, the 2 represents the U.S. and the EU, who were brought in as observers to kind of balance the power out. Taking a different approach than Ruggie is an article by Alexander Thompson, Coercion Through International Organizations, the Security Council, and the Logic of Information Transmission. This author claims that powerful states usually do not use IOs, but since the Cold War, they sometimes channel coercive actions, including the use of force through international organizations. despite viable alternatives that offer more flexibility and control. For states wishing to convince an audience that a plan of action, specifically the use of force against the enemy, a good route is to use IOs such as the United Nations Security Council to communicate those desires, and using a neutral third-party organization like the UN Security Council. That message can be directed at the targeted audience, but also third-party audiences will also receive that information, making it an effective means of communication. The next section is on law and norms. As might be expected in discussing any form of governance, the laws and rules that govern that system should be discussed. Apparently, within the international community, almost all the nations observe almost all the principles of international law and abide by all their obligations almost all the time. Abram Chayes and Antonia Chayes, in their article on compliance, explain that foreign policy activity can involve many processes, but traditionally there are three phases: negotiation, adoption, and implementation of international agreements. In international law treaties, international law treaties are meant to be treated as pacta sunt servanda. Moldova, which is treaties are to be obeyed. That's kind of the basis for international law. And this often influences domestic law. The legislation proposed in Moldova to restrict international funding for domestic civil society organizations actually might be in violation of Article 11 through 1 through 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights, a treaty Moldova is party to, so I'm going to look further into that when I dig into my research. But contradicting Chayes and Chayes' underlying assumption that international law is made and followed all the time is David Lake. In his article, Right for Rules, Authority, Order, and the Foundations of Global Governance, he asserts that global governance can be better understood as being a relational authority, which treats authority as a social contract in which a governor provides a political order of value to a community in exchange for compliance. Essentially what his theory posits is that nations will conform to the authority through which order is granted. This system of social regulation maintenance is less formal than treaty-based systems, but thus potentially less visible. Lake contends that through this relational theory, substantial international authority is being wielded in some unlikely places if we only have the eyes to look, so beyond traditional legal mechanisms, which makes it harder to observe, which would require in-depth research. The last section is on negotiation, reflecting on the 5+2 negotiation format I've discussed it in my questions. An article, Development of Integrative Solutions in Bilateral Negotiation. Pruitt et al. Demonstrate how to achieve better results for all parties in negotiation. Pruitt et al. Explore what they call integrative solutions. They define integrative solutions as results that produce greater joint utility that through the creative process by which bargainers discover new options that are better for both parties than those currently under consideration. The authors find that the approach a negotiator takes when at the negotiating table has a profound impact on the results afterwards. Their findings suggest that when a negotiator takes a more collaborative approach, taking the time to really reconsider old ideas and brainstorm new ones, more integrative solutions will be reached, resulting in better results for all parties. This is called expanding the bar. Thank you very much.